Hello everyone and welcome back to Mossy Bottom. This video is about how to choose a small holding or a homestead or a property to turn into one, like the dream cottages which I've featured in my new video series, based on how you want to live. I'm going to run through different scenarios in which you're 20, 40, 60, 80 and maybe even 100% self-sufficient. And within each of those I'll try and identify how much you should grow of different types of food, what animals you might want to prioritize, how much land you'll likely need, and how many man or woman hours it will probably take to run. The key factors when choosing a property to suit your own smallholding dreams are 1. How much time per week am I able and willing to invest in it? 2. How much additional income do I have to rely on? And 3, this is probably the most important, what am I most passionate about? Remember, this is all from my own perspective, having lived here on my own smallholding for about 5 years. I grow my own food, I keep livestock, I gather water from a spring, I have solar panels, I coppice my own woodland for fuel, and to pay for the things which I can't self-produce, there are always those like internet and car insurance, I sell excess produce, eggs, strawberries in the summer, vegetables, and of course I make YouTube videos. All of what I'm going to tell you is also dependent on climate. Do bear that in mind. I'm in Ireland, it's quite wet and quite mild in the winter. It's going to be different in different parts of the world. It's also dependent on location, how near a town are you, and your personal circumstances. This is just a guide, folks. But with that said, let's get started. The first thing I want to talk about is land, fundamental to any smallholding or homestead, and what you generally don't get living in a city or urban area. In this country, land is sold by the acre, and it's graded by auctioneers based, I think, on its road frontage and its agricultural value. It might be described as productive grassland, as pasture suitable for grazing, as marginal pasture, marginal bogland, or just plain old bog. And the price varies dramatically from as much as €20,000 an acre for prime agricultural land in the east of Ireland to as little as €2,000 an acre for marginal pasture or bogland in a county like Roscommon or Mayo in the west. And I'm sure it's pretty similar in other countries. This isn't specific to Ireland. When I talk about the value of land in my Dream Cottages videos, I do so from the perspective of a smallholder, not a farmer. Why are those perspectives different? Well, I'm going to show you. My neighbour who owns this field is a farmer. He keeps cows for beef. Those cows compact this soil, which causes rushes to grow in the hoof prints, and you can see hundreds of them behind me. That degrades the quality of the land year on year and means less grass to feed his livestock and more flooding because of compaction. From his perspective as a farmer, this clay-rich, compacted soil prone to waterlogging in the winter isn't very good. In fact, like many farmers around here, he calls this the Badlands. This is my land. It's separated from the field I've just shown you by a single barbed wire fence. Beyond that is the field I was just filming in. In terms of the soil texture, that is the percentage of clay to sand to silt, it's identical, heavy clay. In terms of the rainfall and flooding in winter, it's also identical. It's at the same elevation at the bottom of a slope, and every winter after heavy rain, this land floods. But the soil here is dark and friable. It doesn't have any rushes growing in it. It's not compacted. It's healthy and produces huge crops of vegetables every year. Why is that? Well, because this is a smallholding, and on a smallholding you are effectively a gardener, not a farmer. I improve this soil by adding organic matter from my compost every year. I cover it in the winter to prevent nitrogen runoff. I use my pigs to turn it, which, being coonies, a very small breed, don't compact the soil, unlike modern cows, which are much, much heavier than cows used to be 100 years ago. I don't put heavy machinery on it like tractors, unlike most farmers. I allow it to recover, going fallow every 3rd year. I manage it within an organic system, and by taking that approach, you can turn what is graded agriculturally as marginal land, or bogland even, into abundance. It's now November, winter is just a month away, and you can see how healthy it looks. But the sad truth is that today there aren't many smallholders like me managing the soil and land in this way. That's not always been the case though. You only have to go back 2 or 3 generations and almost everyone who lived here and called themselves a farmer did exactly what I'm doing. And I know that because I've asked my neighbours, most of whom are farmers themselves. They remember their grandparents who lived on the same land, growing cabbages, carrots, potatoes, all sorts of vegetables to feed their own families. They'd also sell them in the village. They'd keep pigs for meat and chickens for eggs. And they'd grow oats and barley right here in the very badlands that surround my smallholding. Grain production in the west of Ireland. That's what this building, my granary, was originally built to store. What's my point? Well, the type of land that you need as a smallholder is not the same as the type of land that you need as a commercial farmer. And the difference in price between prime agricultural land and marginal land is enormous. So if your goal is to be a smallholder and you have a limited budget to spend, and let's face it, who doesn't, then view land through the lens of a smallholder like me, with the power of an organic system and practices like permaculture at your disposal. Okay, that said, let's now introduce some different scenarios. And remember, this is not set in stone. There are many ways to peel a potato. Actually, there aren't many ways to peel a potato, but you know what I mean. What's the original saying? There are many ways to skin a cat? Moving on. So let's start with around 20% self-sufficient. That is providing 20% of your costs through your own smallholding. If that was my goal, what would it look like? Well, first I'd install a large polytunnel like the one I have here. And I'd grow as much produce for myself and my family as I could. I might also grow a few rows of potatoes outside, as that's relatively little work. And plant some apple trees definitely for fruit. In terms of livestock, my focus at that level would be on chickens, which are easy to look after and produce organic, free-range eggs, a high-value item, in exchange for grass and layers pellets or other grains, which are comparatively cheap. I'd try and set up a rainwater collection system and improve the insulation of my home to reduce energy costs. I think to achieve this, all you'd need is a large garden. It's even doable in the suburbs. And in terms of time, about maybe 1 day's work per week for one person. Though it would probably be a bit more than that in the spring and summer and a bit less in the autumn and winter. The important thing to say about this option is you would need a significant income, be it from a full-time job, which you would probably have time for, a partner, a pension or savings. It's a great retirement option, I think. Now let's move on to around 40% self-sufficient. If that was my goal, what would I need to add? Well, primarily, my focus at that point would be on growing more food, particularly an outdoor crop. I'd grow more potatoes, carrots, beetroot, brassicas, strawberries, and I suppose other relatively high-value foods when purchased fresh to mitigate that cost. I'd plant fruit bushes as well, particularly currants and raspberries, in addition to the apple trees. In terms of livestock, I'd next introduce ducks for slug control now that there's a bigger vegetable patch outside. And of course for eggs. Indian runner ducks, khaki Campbells and my Abercott Rangers, as well as many other breeds, are prolific layers of very large, delicious, yolky eggs. At this level, I'd also begin preserving produce for the winter, either by freezing, canning, as I've started to do myself, or even dehydrating, which is something I want to experiment with next year. And I might even introduce some foraging for mushrooms and other wild foods, and potentially fishing if it's available in my area. I would also invest in a small chainsaw, something I've been doing for a long time, and begin coppicing my hedgerows and trees to dry and season as a source of fuel to burn for supplementary heat over the winter, and as a source of wood chips to enrich my organic compost, which I'd need for those vegetables. For this to work, I think you'd need more like half an acre of land, which is about half what I have here at Mossy Bottom. And this would probably represent more like 2 to 3 days work per week for one person, so still achievable part-time. You would, of course, still need a significant outside income. A good option perhaps would be if one partner is still working in a mainstream job and the other wants to run a smallholding in this way, perhaps while raising a family at the same time. Next, we have 60% self-sufficient, and this is about the level which I think I've achieved so far. So what additional steps would that require? Well, in terms of food production, I'd scale it up, growing enough potatoes to feed me and anyone else living with me for a full year. That's around 25 square meters per person. At least here in Ireland it is. It might be different in different countries. I'd definitely grow more root vegetables, more brassicas and winter feed for animals. I'd also crucially start growing cash crops to sell either in a local shop, farmers markets, or just on a stall at the end of my lane. At the moment, my main cash crop here at Mossy Bottom is strawberries in June and mange-tout peas in July, both of which are expensive in the shops but easy to grow on a small holding. To make my life a bit easier with all that veg production, I'd also introduce some pigs like the ones you can probably hear oinking in the background. Now you could, if you wanted, purchase 2 weaners, that's young pigs every year, give them a great life, let them dig up roots and eat weeds, as well as your vegetable waste of course, and then turn them into meat to salt or freeze over the winter. Or like me, you could keep them as working companions. I'd also try in that scenario to introduce bees, though that is quite a significant investment. The payoff after a year or two is huge though, not only because honey is delicious, but because it's a high value item which you can potentially sell locally. Finally, at this level, I'd try and produce my own energy by installing solar panels like the ones I have here at Mossy Bottom. Maybe even a wind turbine as well, or perhaps both. Here in Ireland at least, wind generation is very effective in the winter and solar much more in the summer. Again, a big investment, but long-term yielding a big saving. So this option I think would require about an acre of land, certainly more for those animals, and increased vegetable production. And in terms of time, it would represent more like 4 to 5 days work per week for one person. So basically a full-time job. Though perhaps once established, when your outbuildings are set up, your land is productive, your animal housing created, your soil condition improved, your compost working, your chainsaw skills up to scratch, when you reach that point, it might be a bit less work. 2, 3, 4 years in, things get progressively easier, so there is that to look forward to. At this level though, you'd still need an additional income. But a part-time job or even gainful unemployment, as I talked about in my income stream video, would probably be enough. Okay, now things are getting really interesting. What about 80% self-sufficient? The obvious thing to try and introduce at this level is goats or cows for dairy. Producing and then processing milk to make things like butter, cheese and yogurt is of course a time-consuming activity, but it's also very enjoyable. And again, you'd potentially be producing a high-value item which you could sell locally. But to hit that 80% mark, I think you would also need more land. And there are 2 options here. You could attempt to grow grains, oats and barley, like the former occupants of this cottage did in years gone by. maybe even spelt. But for that, you would need to consider the agricultural quality of the land. Investing in the machinery needed to process it could also be expensive. Our ancestors would have done it all by hand with man and woman power, but that's a very labour-intensive process. The advantage is you could make your own porridge, bread, beer, pizza dough, pasta, and of course you'd have plentiful animal feed. But to take that step, in addition to everything else, would, I think, represent a full-time job for 2 people, not 1. The reason the grandparents and great-grandparents of my farming neighbours here were able to produce their own oats and barley in the Badlands of Western Ireland is that they were fit and young and worked together as families on their own land. The second option to hit that 80% level is to use that extra land not to produce grains, which, let's face it, are pretty cheap to buy and hard to grow, but instead to produce a higher value crop like a pick-your-own strawberry field, or organic vegetable production, which has a growing market year on year. You could also turn that land into a self-sufficient business, like on-site accommodation, camping, glamping, tiny homing, dog and cat boarding, horse riding, if that's your passion. There are quite a few options, and I personally would take that path over producing grain. But that said, if you prefer the purest route, then other than a lot of hard work, there is no reason why you couldn't do so, especially if you live in the east of Ireland or anywhere really with a slightly warmer, better climate. How much land then would this option require? Well, it depends really on what you want to do. For an accommodation-based business, location is much more important than quality or quantity of land. If you want to grow grains, prioritise quality of land over quantity and location. For vegetables, as long as the soil is fertile, which means clay-rich really, then it's less important. What I will say is that if you have a clear plan, choose the best property to fulfill that in. And if you have a dream property, then choose the best plan that most suits that land. Finally, 100% self-sufficient. Is that even achievable, I hear you ask? Well, if your self-sufficient business is doing well, it's more than achievable. But in that purest sense, without a way to make money, you definitely have to give up an internet connection, a phone line, a car, all main services, the ability to buy anything like books, or get on a bus or train if you're in town. You'd have no money to repair or replace tools. Life would be very different to even my life as it is now. But there are stories of people out there who do live that way. And who's to say you or I wouldn't be happier without all those things? It's terribly arrogant, I think, to assume that our ancestors were unhappy just because they didn't have cars or phones or electricity even. In all likelihood, though their lives were physically much harder, I'm sure they were also tremendously fit, spent more time with their families, had less mental health problems, and were on the whole happier. A hard life isn't necessarily a bad life, but an easy life is a hard one to give up, at least entirely. To work out which smallholding or homestead is right for you, don't just consider your budget, but remember those key factors. 1, how much time per week are you able and willing to invest? 2, how much additional income do you have to rely on? And 3, the most important, I think, what are you most passionate about? Because passion fuels hard work and success, so do what you love. And remember, if you have already started a smallholding here in Ireland, having come from a different life and background, then I would love to hear your story and potentially interview you for a new video series here on the channel. It's going to explore the lives of other people in this beautiful but challenging country who live a similar way to me. So if that's you and you're not too camera shy, then get in touch with me. For now though, that's just about it for this video. I have to admit I'm getting a bit chilly. It is well into November now, so time to go put a jumper on and start my fire. Thank you, as always, for watching, subscribing and supporting the channel in the many ways that you do. I'm often asked who this content is aimed at. And the answer for every one of my videos, from the very beginning to now, has always and will always be anyone who is interested in self-sufficient practices, growing food, keeping animals, restoring buildings, or indeed just dreaming of making a change to their own lives, regardless of where you live, what your nationality is, or where you hope to live in the future. So from me, wherever you are in the world, take care and bye for now. Oh, I was born in a Quaker town where folks worked good and hard for the ones they loved and got above. Each day they punched their card, and when evening came back home again, they'd rest a while and say, "'Tis a hard old life, but for kids and wife we'll work as another day." When the sun rose low, back to work they'd go, singing on their way. Oh, for job and home to call our own, we'll work as another